I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm your co-host, Matt Bernko.
And I'm your other co-host, Dean Ditloff.
All right, folks, we've got a very sexual podcast today.
A great energy to start off.
Yeah, a really uncomfortable energy for me, but that's okay. This week on the podcast, we've got Brian G. Murphy and Shannon Kearns from queertheology.com, where they have a cool podcast and all kinds of other really great resources for queer theology. It's a cool conversation that I think goes to places that our podcast often doesn't and can't because of life situations of Dean and I, and I think that's good. It's a good thing to have a more interesting and expansive conversation, and I, for one, am here for it.
Same. It's good to figure out just how repressed I am in conversation with other people, and that is genuinely useful to me. I really liked it. It was a lot of fun, and we haven't had guests on the show in a long time either, so it's been nice to just get some other voices in the conversation. However, if you wanted to hear even more of just Matt and I, what a segue. How about that? You could sign up to our Patreon, where you can support us at patreon.com/the Magnificast. And there we have an extra podcast that we do once a month called the Magnificast Lock-In. It's great. It's a bunch of goofs and spoofs about Christian culture and current events and all your good Marxist leftist Christian takes. We've also got a great Discord community that you can get plugged into through that Patreon. And people are talking about everything from, I don't know, what's going on in the Discord lately, Matt. Some great recipes going around. You posted some good dog video. Love seeing that.
That's right. A lot of dog videos lately. It's just from me specifically.
A lot of dog videos. Some really good book reviews. Been enjoying that. Just finding out what people are reading. Lots of good stuff over there. You can get it all at patreon.com/the Magnificast.
Man, in the years that we've been doing this Patreon podcast, why have we never leaned into the goofs and spoofs tagline? I think that's great. I'm going to make sure I add that to the mythos of the Patreon podcast. All right. Well, before we get too far down the rabbit hole and more digressions, let's go to Brian and Shannon and get to this great conversation. Welcome to the show, Brian and Shannon. It's good to have you both on. Whenever we have a new guest on the show or new guests on the show, we always ask them to give an elevator pitch to introduce themselves and their work. So supposing that this is like a very long elevator and we're going to go to the top floor, how would you both introduce yourselves and your work, and how would you tell us what you're all about?
Sure. Well, my name's Brian G. Murphy. Pronouns that I use to describe myself are he, him, his, or they, them, theirs. And I'm joined by my queertheology.com co-founder, Father Shea, who can introduce himself in just a second. But I would say that we work at the intersections of spirituality and sexuality and gender, mostly from a Christian and post-Christian background that takes is it okay to be queer as the starting point rather than the finish line in the conversation, and looks for ways in which our queerness can enrich our spirituality and our spirituality can enrich our queerness, and help folks recover from purity culture, unpack shame, build thriving relationships with other people, with their bodies, set and maintain healthy boundaries with their families, and have practices that support sort of their thriving.
Yeah, and we've been doing this work now we're coming up on 10 years, 10-year anniversary. And so we've been doing that work through a variety of means. We have a podcast that for the first 6 years was looking at the lectionary, and now is more broadly looking at the Bible and having a lot of guests and conversations. We have online courses and an online community, and lots of resources for folks who are on the journey, for allies and church leaders, and everyone across the board.
So cool. Well, welcome. Glad to have both of you here. And 10 years is a long time. Lots of really cool stuff I'm sure that you've done in that decade.
Yeah.
Lots of things to look back on. Yeah, I had never heard of you before I met Matt. And then Matt was telling me that he had been reading some of your stuff for a long time. So it's been fun to get to know some of that as well. We've talked about queer theology a handful of times on this podcast with a number of guests who are better equipped to do that than the two of us for lots of reasons. But you've got the website, you have the domain name, and so I feel like we should just start there. How would you characterize queer theology? What's it about? Why is it important? If you had to, just sort of tell somebody in a nutshell, like how might you pitch that to them?
Yeah, so we always talk about queer theology from a definition by the Reverend Dr. Patrick Chang, who wrote a book called Radical Love. And he talks about the use of the word queer as a verb, that to queer something is to challenge it, to challenge the status quo, and that to do queer theology is to lift up the voices that had previously been silenced, discarded, or ignored. And so that's like a really simple way of saying, we think that queer theology starts from a place that centers queer and trans lives and experiences, that does theology from our first-person perspectives, but that isn't just for queer and trans folks, that us doing theology from our unique perspectives actually opens up something really beautiful for straight and cisgender folks as well. And it feels important to note that, there is an entire academic discipline of queer theology, and then there are queer theologians like Brian and I, and folks that are kind of doing this work in lots and lots of ways. We did get lucky enough to buy the domain name, but we are obviously not the creators of this academic discipline. But our work has really been centered on taking the incredible work that's being done in the academy, but also making it really, really accessible to people who aren't from academic backgrounds, and really grounding it in, what does queer theology do for us practically in our bodies, in our churches, here, now, today.
Yeah, all of what Shay said, that historically queer theology has been an academic discipline, but we recognize the ways in which it can transform everyone's lives, and that we don't think that you have to go to seminary or get a PhD to sort of do queer theology, to wrestle with theology queerly, or queerness theologically, and that doing that on any level in any way can enrich your life. Even I think if you don't necessarily identify as a Christian still, that we all move through the world informed by religion outside of ourselves, and also move through the world in sort of religiously ways, even if it's not a formal religion. And so paying attention to that, I think is like a good practice for everyone. And so that's why we started this project, like Shay said, to make the academic accessible.
Yeah, that's cool. Making the academic accessible, it's a great goal. It's something to definitely strive for. I guess, what does that look like in your work? What does it mean to do queer theology outside of academia, right? What does it mean to really put it into practice in your work?
Yeah, so I think our work has two main focuses. One is doing queer theology, creating queer theology. So in the same way that academics are creating queer theology, we strive to create new original queer theology. And to be academically rigorous about it, we both studied religion in different capacities. Myself an undergraduate, Shay, both in undergrad and at seminary. So to sort of do that academically rigorously, and to cite our sources, and to be specific about it, but also to, find ways to do that doesn't rely on using words like hermeneutics all the time. To put the words in words that everyday folks can understand, but to still do, at the essence, I think we're still doing the same sort of work that more sort of proper queer theologians, traditional queer theologians like Dr. Patrick Chang or Marcella Althaus-Reid are doing. So that's one part of it, is doing this, but so that instead of like writing, dissertations and like book articles for academic journals and really dense academic books, we're, writing articles and emails and making videos and doing talks and recording podcasts. And then the other portion of our work is teaching people to do queer theology also, so that you don't have to have studied religion in college or at seminary in order to like access this practice, which we think is healing and liberatory and life-giving and can fuel activism if you want it to, can fuel your relationships. And so teaching people, sometimes we just call it like sacred storytelling, because queer theology, can feel intimidating to folks. For people to find their own connection to sacred stories and find those parallels and to tell their own queer sacred story, whether that's to their journal, to their group of friends, just to the other participants in a class with us, or like to put on Instagram or Facebook or YouTube or their own podcast or to start a blog, whatever that might be for them. So like both like doing and teaching, right? These are two big buckets of our work, I would say.
I like that, especially that emphasis on the utility of it and the creativity of it, and trying to proliferate some more expressions and kind of making that an exciting thing. I think that's so cool. I am tempted to ask like a quasi-academic question. I'm trying to figure out if I should follow it. I guess I'm just going to give into it. It's Lent, but I'm going to do it anyway. You brought up Marcella Altus Reed, and we talk a lot about liberation theology and fascinating in liberation theology, queer theology, maybe a Venn diagram kind of thing. And that emphasis, too, on theology coming out of lived experience, coming out of marginalized experience, and so on. It just feels like that's a pretty natural affinity. Could you guys talk a little bit more about that? Like, how do those discourses or motifs, or however you want to put it, how do they kind of come together?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we consider ourselves siblings to all liberation theologies and theologians, right? That it's all of the same impulse. And that something actually really powerful happens when we put all of the theologies that are coming from particular places into conversation with one another. Because like there's something really powerful from that I learn about myself from reading Black theologians, and that I learn from reading womanist theologians and Latin American liberation theologians, right? Like that all of that is stuff that I'm learning about my own power and privilege and the ways that I need to give that away and be in solidarity and be an accomplice with other people. And that also informs my work. And so like, I think all of it it's not even a Venn diagram for me, right? It's like a circle. It's like circles layered on top of each other. But that we don't feel like we're inventing or starting anything new, that we are simply in conversation with all of this work that's been being done for a really long time. We're just naming the particular place and location that we come from. And also very aware that like, we're not the only people doing queer theology, and that there are other like intersections of identity of folks that obviously are not represented. Brian and I are both white. We're both male presenting. And so like, it's important that I think what we're trying to do in the teaching space, especially, is to like equip and empower other people to say that like, you can do this work too. And we actually really need you to do this work. We need your voices. We need your stories. We need your particular lived experience and the ways that you see theology, because like, that's important for the growth of us, right? Like we need all of us doing this work to be fully informed and to be fully in solidarity with one another.
Yeah. Like I made a video a few years ago called Jesus is Polyamorous, right? But I also we can also talk about Jesus being asexual, or Jesus being trans, or Jesus being gay. And like there's not like one correct interpretation. And I think for those of us who either like grew up with or just familiar with conservative religion, right? There's this idea that like you read this one passage and there's like, you have to figure out like the right answer for it. And actually it's like, you can read this one passage and there's just like layer after layer after layer after layer after layer, meaning that you can pull from it. And like when we were doing the podcast that followed the lectionary, between Shannon and I, we would have like a few different things that we could say about any given passage. And that's just the two of us. And then like when you add in everyone else's experiences and their perspectives, like there's so many more perspectives. And that sort of like, I think chorus of voices is like gives us a more full picture of each other and of the divine.
Yeah, that's cool. I mean, I think that's something that Dean and I have found on this podcast as well, that the Bible is, not exhaustive as a text, right? There's always something a little bit more that it can give you in a different situation and in light of different circumstances. But like you said a minute ago, right, it's hard to teach people that. I wonder how that's worked out in your work, like, coming to the table with queer theology and kind of encouraging people to be creative with it and to read the Bible in these different ways. Like, how does that work out for you all? Do you feel like you get pushback from people very often? Like, I mean, you mentioned it even at the top of the show that you're doing work for people who are Christian and post-Christian. And I wonder, like, does that approach to the Bible, like, does it rub against people in a way that is productive or unproductive? I don't know. What do you think?
It's all of the above, right? I mean,
yes,
we've gotten everything from like hate mail and death threats from people who are, really upset about queer readings of scripture to folks who, for whom doing this work, it makes them really uncomfortable because we're not giving one right answer. We're inviting them into the mystery, and it's a lot easier to be given an answer and be told this is what to believe. To folks who I think are reticent or nervous about bringing their own selves to the text because they've been taught for so long that like this is not a story for them, that they aren't allowed to see themselves in it. And I think that like it's in that latter part where we can really kind of get in the mix with someone and that really generative and beautiful things happen. The death threat folks, we just try to block and move on. But I think, the important piece of all of this to me is what Brian said earlier, that like this is grounded in scholarship. This is grounded in rigor. Like we take the Bible incredibly seriously, and we're not trying to read things into the text that aren't there. What we're trying to do is pay attention to what is already there. And I think that like once folks understand that that's what we're doing, they tend to be a little bit more open to it. And if they aren't open to that, then our work is not for them anyway. Like we're just never going to have a fruitful conversation with someone who reads the Bible as inerrant and infallible. Like that's just not, we don't think that that's a good way to read the text. So we're not going to do that.
Yeah. And one of the things that Shannon often says is that all theology has a context. It's just that like queer folks and women and Black folks and Latinx folks, like either those labels are put on them or they just have to label themselves as that. But actually, like mainstream Christian theology is white male European theology. We just don't call it that, right? We call it like Christian theology. And so part of our work and the work of everyone is to like recognize that like the way you've been like taught to read the Bible or the plain meaning of scripture or the literal meaning of scripture or whatever it might be is actually someone's equally biased perspective on scripture. They've just convinced us all that that's the objective truth. And so I think part of queering theology is also to name like this is our theology and this is your theology too. I mean, once you start to recognize that like, oh, the straight white male pastors are also reading scripture from their context and looking for themselves in scripture, like what we're doing is not any different than they are. They just have the power.
Yeah, well, maybe that's a great segue to ask you a little bit about how that does open up some of the scriptures. I'm a person totally, completely socialized as a white heterosexual male, growing up in the U.S. and now living in Canada. And yes, try as I might, I'm sure there are all kinds of really wild things I'm missing out on by reading the Bible with that kind of background and not being attuned to some of the things that you guys are able to pull out and parse out. So what might be some things that you found to be really like interesting, helpful, something that maybe an average reader like me would miss or not be able to appreciate?
Oh man, I'm gonna set Shay up for this because the first time that this is our little like you're gonna have to deal with our shtick. Like I don't remember the first time we met. Shay and I actually met, but the first time I remember meeting Shay was one of our good mutual friends brought me to hear Shay speak to preach at Judson Memorial in New York City, and he was co-preaching this sermon on Ezekiel and the dry bones. And when it ended, I was like, holy shit. That was like brand new theology. It was not like some pastor telling some story that he like read in Chicken Soup for the Soul or that like he heard one of his preaching professors like teacher. It wasn't like a remix of some book he read. Like Shay just like whoop, like reached into his life and pulled this out. And you know, part of it was about bodies and being trans, but I was like, it was informed by Shay's trans experience, but like, I'm not trans. And I was like, oh, I need more. I need more of this. And so like, I've been particularly moved by, as a cis person, a lot of Shay's trans theology work.
Yeah, and I think what is so beautiful about the work, right, is that, like Brian said, it's rooted in trans experience, but it actually opens up something really beautiful for people who aren't trans. And that's what got me hooked on doing queer theology, because I told a story in seminary and I saw my classmates who were not trans, their faces light up. And I was like, oh, there's something really powerful happening here. So when I was talking about the Ezekiel passage, you know, I grew up in a tradition, I grew up a fundamentalist evangelical in a tradition that very much was not great about bodies, right? It was like, you just tolerate your flesh and your flesh is evil. And then when you get to go to heaven, like you'll get an all new spiritual body and like your body doesn't matter. And growing up trans as someone who like didn't particularly like my body, it was really easy to hold on to that theology because it was like, look, I'm just being super holy and spiritual and I don't ever have to think about my body. But then when I started to transition, I was like, oh, I am actually an embodied human and like I'm feeling all of these things again and like I have to actually deal with my body. And I was reading that Ezekiel passage, which is the one where Ezekiel is brought to a field of dry bones and he's told to speak to the bones and to make them live. And he speaks to the bones and the bones reconnect and the whole host of an army stands up again. And, you know, growing up, I had always been taught that it was like he had a field of dancing skeletons. And if you like Google that passage, all of the art is like dancing skeletons. But if you actually read the text, like these bodies came fully alive with like skin and sinew and muscle and breath. And I just had this moment of like, oh, God actually really does care about our bodies. And that this idea of God caring so deeply about a community to bring their bodies back from exile so that they wouldn't be separated. Like there's something really holy in that I feel in my own trans experience, that I'm being brought back from exile and being reunited with my own body. But then the challenge of that sermon became, there are a whole lot of bodies that are still not resurrected. And so it becomes our job to go speak to those bones and to ask the question, you know, who will make these bones live? And our response should be, it's on us to go out and to do the work of justice to make sure that everyone can be brought back from exile. So that was one of the first pieces that I did around like bringing my own experience to a text, and it was transformative for me, and I think it was also like transformative when I shared it for other people, and I was like, oh, this is the juice, like this is how we do this work. And it's not about necessarily looking for trans stories or gay characters. It's about what does the essence of transness or the essence of queerness, like how can we find that already reflected in these texts and bring that out in a really powerful way.
I'm sold. I'm convinced. It was great. Loved it.
Yeah, a really compelling story, I think. I mean, that's such a cool through line, though, I think, in lots of other sort of types of liberation theology, right? Bringing, you know, how do we see ourselves in the text, whether it's, you know, the poor, it's, you know, the oppressed and so on, right? And how can we tell our stories alongside that text? It's great. It's great to see those overlapping circles, like you're saying earlier. Well, something else I think it'd be interesting to talk with you both about is that maybe this is kind of like an apologetics question, or it's a question about apologetics, maybe. Like, conversations that I often see that revolve around LGBTQ people and Christianity, they always get stopped like really short because, I mean, for pretty clear reasons, like queer people are just trying to like fight for their recognition as people sometimes. And then a lot of conversations just get like bottled up at really surface level questions like, can a Christian be gay, or can a Christian be trans, right? These like very top line sort of things. And those questions are fine and good, and people need to answer them, and I think that's great. But they also seem to be like, you know, shallow, right? Just like, can these people exist? Like, yes or no? So I guess what kind of deeper questions I think are the rest of us missing out on because we're too busy just like arguing about these things? Like, what else is under the surface that we should be paying attention to?
Oh man, I love this question because one of the reasons why we started this project was like, it's just wild to me how much the conversation has moved over the past 10 years. That when we first started it, the entirety of the public conversation around LGBTQ issues and Christianity was like, is it okay to be gay and Christian? Is it okay to be trans and Christian? Can you be LGBTQ? Like side A versus side B. Let's debate it. The great debate. And we were like, F this. We like are not interested in having this conversation. We find it boring. We find it reductive. We find it actually like spiritually violent to subject queer people to questioning like their inherent humanity. And also like this question has been asked and answered like decades ago, right? And when people do teachings on it, it's like, it's not like someone found some new copy of the Bible that doesn't have Leviticus 18 in it, right? Like all of the same arguments are ones that have been around since like at least the 70s, if not earlier. So like we have all of the data. And so like if there was a magic way to explain away the quote unquote like the clobber passages, like we would have found it already. So like we have to like stop doing this thing that is like very clearly not working, which is debating clobber passages over and over and over again. It's just like running your head into a wall. And so I think that when we like move beyond that, some questions that like I'm interested in exploring are like, how is God queer? Where do you find the sacred in your queerness? How is like sex in particular a sacred experience? Like, how do we relate to our bodies as temples, as having the divine dwelling us, as being made in the image of God? What does it look like to be part of a beloved community? How could you like what can Christians who have the book of Acts in their Bible learn about the church in Acts from queer communities who formed chosen families, who like, you know, in the early 2000s and the aughts, like who were able to get trans people surgeries by way of GoFundMe's. Like, you know, Shay often says like we were passing the same $20 around, you know, on everyone's GoFundMe from like 2005 to 2000, like honestly still until today, right? But like when you like share everything amongst you, then there are no needy in your midst. I remember rereading Acts as a like queer person in Brooklyn, living with a bunch of queer friends and doing activism and being like, oh, like I've never experienced a church in Acts in Christianity, but I'm experiencing it in this sort of like interfaith, some of us are Christian, some of us are Jewish, some of us are atheist, like friend group and extended family network. And I think that like, so also what are the ways in which straight Christianity or straight, insert your religion here, could be improved and enriched by tapping into the wisdom of queer folks?
And I think that there's such a power in queer and trans stories and queer and trans readings of scripture that like just we never get to because we're stuck in this dumb argument that doesn't even like that cedes all of the power to one way of reading scripture, which isn't even the way the vast majority of the world reads scripture. And so I think that like that too is a pushback against like, we don't have, I'm going to take this again. There's something that happens when we get stuck in this 101 defending ourselves conversation, and it exhausts queer and trans folks. And I think that that is the point, right? The point isn't actually to have a dialogue or to learn, because if someone wanted to have a dialogue or to learn, they could read Is the Homosexual My Neighbor by Virginia Ramey Mullincott, which came out in 1979. And that's the argument. I think that instead it's really designed to play a gotcha game of like, you're not really a Christian, you don't take your faith seriously, you don't take scripture seriously. And what we have found is actually when we refuse to have that conversation with people, when we've either said, no, you're going to listen to our stories and you're going to listen to us talk about our faith journey, that has moved the needle much further and much faster. And if someone's not willing to listen to our story, then they weren't actually going to listen to us talk about the clobber passages either. And so that just refusing to have that conversation has saved us, I think, a lot of time and angst. And like one of our big boundary setting things is like, you too do not need to have this conversation. Like you too can point people to an article or a book. And I think that like if someone isn't willing to do that work, then they aren't actually interested in having a conversation with you. And so it's a protective measure for yourself to like not keep putting your heart out there for people who aren't having a conversation or an argument in good faith.
And I'll also say that as a cis queer person, I like find it frustrating, right? That like I get reduced to sex, right? That's all people want to talk about when it comes to me. Like straight people also have sex lives that like probably need a lot more interest, or at least as much introspection and critique as queer sex lives. But like no one's like peppering straight people constantly about their sex lives, or if it is, it's in the context of a bunch of other stuff, right? And so like I want to be like, straight people have sex also. Straight people need to learn about sex. Straight people need to talk about sex. And also, I do think that like queer people have some sort of like unique wisdom when it comes to sex generally and sex and spirituality in particular. And so I don't want like LGBTQ equality or justice or inclusion to mean that like queer people also stop talking about sex, just like straight people have stopped talking about sex, or that like queer people's sex becomes more like straight people's sex. That like, I want to talk about the ways in which like what did queer people learn about AIDS, both like gay men and bi men who were affected by AIDS, that like lost all of their friends and lovers and sex partners, that had to like stare death in the face and choose love and connection anyways. Like, what did like lesbians who took care of their like dying gay men learn about that? What did we learn about community care? In what ways like did we like have we like worked to undo shame and to name and claim our sexual desires and to be in touch with our bodies and to care about other people? And that like there's a lot of power there. I was talking to a friend of a friend who's a rabbi, and he was saying like, oh yeah, like I think that he's straight, and he was like, I think that like a lot of straight people that I know, we like don't talk about sex. We don't talk during sex. We just kind of like come together and we do the sex. And it seems like not all gay people, but like a lot of the gay people that I know, they like think about what they want sexually. They communicate that. They like talk during sex. And like, I think that actually like there's something to learn there. And so I think recognizing the unique wisdom that queer people have, and I like my vision for like a more just and equal future is not that queerness gets subsumed by heterosexuality and straight culture, but that like straightness becomes straight people and straightness itself becomes like more queered.
That's great. Also, I'm straight enough that it is terrifying for me to hear Ellie say those things. Now I have to think about my life and myself afterwards, but I guess I'll do that.
You're welcome.
So I appreciate that gift and challenge. Yeah. But I think that's great too. And what you were saying, Shay, also about like, I guess the sort of bit about clobber passages and moving on and trying to see the depth that you're dealing with here, Brian, as well is so useful. And even in my own experience, like I was a teenage evangelical fundamentalist and, whatever, had all kinds of biblical stuff, but it was encounters with gay friends and so on, and hearing their stories and all the rest of it that eventually led me to realize I was bad at reading the Bible, right, in this kind of recursive way too. And I think that's great. You mentioned, Brian, sort of the maybe like the shift in conversation you've seen over the decade, right? Starting out maybe with some of those problems and then being able to have this more, I don't know, interesting kind of exploration. It just strikes me that like it's bad time for a lot of things right now, politically speaking, but especially trans and other LGBT and queer issues in the United States, but also here in Canada. The border is pretty permeable. And, what is it like for you both to be maybe navigating that space and in this kind of public theology way, like trying to, think through that moment of like being on the defense and also still wanting to celebrate those things that you're celebrating? What's it like to sort of do that, outside the academy in that public
terrifying on one hand.
Yeah, I think, I think for me, the moment of how far the conversation has gone and shifted and changed is really beautiful in a lot of ways. Like, we feel really grateful that there is more openness to a larger conversation. And also the backlash against trans folks right now is really quite terrifying. And I think what feels hard for me in particular is the overwhelming silence of the church on this issue, and even the overwhelming silence of other queer Christians and progressive folks who there's a lot of folks who spend a lot of time telling me how much they love me, but I'm not seeing any concerted effort to challenge the bills in their state or to even do education of their friends and their coworkers. And I think that we're in a time where we really need to be stepping up and paying attention, and that these conversations around trans issues are about bodily autonomy, and that it's about more than just an attack on trans people, right? It's not going to stop with just trans folks. And so to pay attention to the ways in which our liberation is bound up together, and to make sure that we're doing that solidarity work is really important. It's important for me to be public for as long as I can. That feels really scary at this moment of not knowing what that's going to look like. I moved to rural Kansas this year, and so I'm bordered by Oklahoma, which is now the House has passed the most regressive of all of the trans bills, and Arkansas, which is trying to make it illegal for any trans person to enter any bathroom where a minor might be present, which is like a gas station, right? It's intended to legislate us out of existence. And I think that we need folks to be paying attention, and we need them to be getting loud, and we need them to do it yesterday, right? That's really important that we pay attention to what's happening.
Yeah, it just feels important to name that there's an all-out assault on trans people, and the stated and very clear end goal is the eradication of all trans people, whether that means that they are in jail or they're depressed or they're kill themselves or they're murdered. The stakes are that incredibly high. And so leaving comments on Shannon's Instagram about how be strong and I love you is not enough. It makes me think of the prophet Amos, which is I despise your religious festivals. What I want is justice to roll down. So every time some straight cis person tells a queer person they love them and they haven't spent a month outside of their legislator's office, or every time even a cis queer person tells a trans person I support you, or a white person tells a black person that, is well, what the fuck are you actually doing? Because lives are hanging in the balance here. And it's going to require some action. Right. And for those folks who consider themselves Christian, it's this is what we're talking about. This is what the Gospels are talking about when it's take up your cross and follow me. Right. It doesn't mean stay in an abusive marriage or be gay, but be celibate your whole life. It means be willing to drag your own cross to be crucified, because that is what the gospel requires, and that is what's right. And so I want more of us to be sticking our necks out on the line, more aggressively, because if it's not my neck, it's Shay's neck, and I don't want that for him.
And I think too that this is also a moment where we talk about the importance of queer theology, and it's this is the work that fuels us and fires us up to be willing to be public and to be willing to do the work. And like, this is when your spiritual practice matters. That we talk all the times about, like, this is why you have rituals. Like, you cultivate them so that when shit hits the fan, you have something to fall back on that keeps you going and that gets you involved in justice. And I think that, like, in these moments, I'm going to speak particularly for trans folks. Like, I think that we need this depth of our theology to keep us alive. And we also need moments of joy and celebration, because that too is resistance, right? Like, it's not just fighting for our lives. It's also fighting for one another and loving each other and showing up for one another and like continuing to exist. Like, that too is part of the work. And that this theological grounding, or whatever theological grounding you have, or whatever spiritual practice you have, that is the thing to draw on right now to keep you alive and resisting and present in the face of all of this.
Yeah, I think, man, a lot of good stuff here to deal with. Yeah. But I guess what this immediately triggers in my mind is that I live in Missouri, so not Kansas or Arkansas, but there are 28 laws that have been introduced to the state legislature in Missouri that specifically target trans people, mostly trans kids, whether or not they can play sports, whether or not they can receive gender affirming healthcare, and so on. And it's not only is it terrible, it's also like just very stupid. I was talking though with a sort of activist in this area he's a rabbi in the St. Louis community, who's been, he goes to the state house to testify every chance he possibly can. And anyways, I was talking with him, and he was telling me this story about the first time he went to testify about one of these anti-trans bills. It was, I guess, years ago. But he was telling me the story, and he said that he was, he was in there kind of testifying on the behalf of the trans people in his community and his family. Meanwhile, it was also Ash Wednesday, and several of the legislators had like ashes imposed on their heads, right? So he's there like basically begging so for people in his family to have access to the type of healthcare that they need. Meanwhile, there are literal Christians sitting across the room from him who are actively doing this, right? And that always kind of strikes me in these conversations and these like these moments of basically all out war against trans people, that it's not just like right-wing people doing them. It's that they're like, these people who have like Christian motivations, right? They're people who are in one way or another, they're Christians. Like, they're motivated by their faith to do these things, and it's bad and jacked up, right? But I wonder how you all think about that. I mean, it's pretty bad, I think. But like, how do you square that, like, that legacy of like evangelical Christianity and other types of Christianity too, carrying out like awful violence against LGBTQ people, in this case trans people, and like, how do you square that though with like the libertarian spirit that you yourselves find within Christianity? Like, how does that like that weird disconnect and tension exist for you all?
Well, it's complicated, is the first thing to say, because I think you're right. Like, these people do claim Christianity, and I think that we have to grapple with the fact that they are Christian. Like, I don't think it does us any good to say, well, they're not really Christian. Like, clearly, they are coming out of this tradition. They are claiming this tradition, and they have garnered lots and lots of power around this tradition. And so do I think that they are reading scripture and being motivated wrongly? Absolutely. Do I think that like the vast majority of scholars would agree with me and not them? Also, yes. And still, we have to deal with this. And I think for me, it becomes like twofold, right? One, it's about saying for queer and trans folks who find resonance and healing and tradition and home in Christianity, like, you can do that, and you can do that in a way that is healthy and life-giving and holistic and brings liberation for you and for other people. Like, it's important for me to name that we can claim the liberation of this tradition. And also, it's really important that I think one of the things that has happened is that the religious right has been really, really good about talking about their faith in public, talking about why they're voting for certain things in public and connecting that to their faith. And the religious left historically has been really, really bad at that, right? Been unorganized. They haven't been articulate about how their faith connects to this justice work. Sometimes it's because they don't want to be like those religious right people. And like, I get that. And also, I think it is really important for people of faith to be connecting the justice work that they're doing to their faith tradition and being articulate and loud and just as confrontational about that as the religious right has been for years and years and years. I think seeding the public square and the connection between faith and justice to the religious right is like hurting all of us, and that we have to stop that.
Yeah, and I'll say like one of the reasons why I stay connected to this work, even as like whether or not I identify as a Christian has ebbed and flowed over the years, is that like I know that like this is the tradition that I come from. This is the majority of Americans identify as Christian in some way. Conservative Christianity in particular has an outsized influence on American politics, and so like this is where it is, and ignoring it or pretending like it's not there or being like, oh well, like I'm not a Christian anymore, so like I don't have to deal with this. It's like not my problem. Is not actually helpful. But I will say I think that there's like two issues at play, or two approaches that are important, but it's important to not lose sight of both of them. And on the one hand, it's like it's really easy to think of like anti-LGBT stuff as like over there, right? It's the Westboro Baptist Church. It's the Ted Cruz's. It's the Marjorie Taylor Greens. It's, it's not, my parents or my uncle or my friends who are like mostly on board, who would say like, yeah, I support gay rights, but like, they like, well, I don't know about like, well, the bathrooms, or like, what about kids, and are still sort of like harboring these things that are infused by transphobia, that like, it's important to like have those conversations and to confront that, like just as much as it is to like get on Twitter and like rant about some stranger who's never going to read your tweets. So like one is to not ignore or shirk responsibility for like the transphobia or the queerphobia, or the like racism, white supremacy, sexism that happens like in your midst, especially like for men to be around other men who like say sexist things, hold sexist beliefs. Like we really have to like be on guard for those. And also like, we're not going to stop anti-trans legislation in Oklahoma and Arkansas and Missouri by like having conversations just around our dinner tables, our Thanksgiving tables. It's like not enough to like, there's too many of them with too much power to like one at a time try and have these heart-to-heart conversations that like, so it's really important to get involved with like strategic organizing to like rob them of their power, so that like your Uncle Jim might still like think some fucked up things about trans people, but like, if he can't pass legislation or like we have to like be strategic in like interrupting the wheels of oppression. I think it was Dietrich Bonhoeffer, right? Like not just to bandage the victims crushed by the wheel, but to stick a spoke in the wheel itself. It's about organizing as well as individual personal transformation.
Yeah, that is great. Super helpful. As you were both talking, it kind of made me think of this conversation I was in just this week about theology and its role in social movements. And I feel like I have that conversation all the time at work. And the question is always like, what good is it? Like, do you find like, especially in ecumenical spaces where there's lots of different Christians, it's like, do you find the minimal amount of Christianity that like everybody can agree on, which is usually a boring version of it that nobody's really excited about? Or do you kind of like, find the exciting parts of your tradition and kind of risk, I don't know, like maybe overplaying your hand, alienating somebody, but also kind of tapping into something recognizable and so on. And it just strikes me that like, you both are thinking about theology in this really dynamic, powerful way, and also connecting that with the activism side. So maybe you can help me in my day job. How can we sort of bring that theological impulse, voice, tradition, symbols, whatever it might be? How do we bring that into that movement space such that it's not a mirror of the right, but it is its own kind of liberating theological energy? Like, how do we kind of square those two things?
Yeah, I think we're also both not interested in sort of like a watered down, boring ecumenical interfaith thing. And so I think that it's like a yes and, right? That Christians and Jews are going to have like distinct theologies, right? And also even like within Christianity, like Catholics and Methodists and Lutherans are going to have different ways of understanding theology and different things that animate them. And even like different Presbyterians are going to care about different stuff. And so it's not that you have to find like one theology to unite us all, right? And like that has to be the thing that like amps us up. But I think that like if like Catholics can get like you like have like their particular Catholic faith like fire them up, and there's like some Catholic organizing, and like Jewish folks have the stuff that fires them up, and this again, like we're diverse, there might even be a few groups within there, right? And that like sometimes we can come together on like specific actions, specific causes, around like actual actions, right? Where it's like I'm doing this action from like this motivation because like I believe this about like Christ, and I believe this because I believe this comes from sort of like my understanding of Jewish law, but like the result is we both are fighting and trying to stop abortion bans, right? And so like I think like we need our particularities to fire us up, and then we can have like coalitions of folks coming together rather than trying to have like one large organization or a large event that is like meets everyone's spiritual and theological needs, because that's not going to happen. And there might be a rally that like we all end up at, right, to show like strength in numbers, but like recognizing that it's like a tossed salad, not a melting pot, right? That like keeping the distinctiveness of all of our various like movements and theologies, I think is going to be crucial, because otherwise it's like boring and it's like not inspiring, and it's like okay, like peace and love, I guess. Like I don't know, like what does that do?
And I think honestly, like that is one of the things that has hurt the progressive church, like in general, is this sense of like we're just gonna find the middle that everyone feels great with, and we're gonna call it tradition, and then we wonder like why our churches are dying, right? And so I think that this impulse too of just like we just have to sand all of the edges off is not helpful, both theologically nor in political movements. That this kind of rush toward the center usually only helps the people that are already in power, or the people that already have privilege. And so I'd be interested to find out, like, we haven't tried it. So like, let's try a thought experiment where everyone gets really particular and we are even more radical and we demand even more, and we see what happens, and we see if we can get some new energy into our movement.
Yeah, I think everyone is like, why do we keep doing it?
Because we all know how.
Yeah, I'm here for it. I've been a part of too many very boring ecumenical movement type things, and I'm feeling pretty over it. Well, maybe to round out the conversation a bit more here, like, well, I don't know. There are a few trans kids in my life who are right now facing a lot of discrimination from all over the place, and in my opinion, it sucks. I hate it. I hate that they like have to put up with like the weird culture war bullshit that we are like currently all enduring. But from your perspective, as people who are like applying queer theology and kind of like asking people to also engage with it, like what do you think that like queer theology has to offer them? People who are just now kind of figuring out who they are while they're constantly under siege from all kinds of other pieces of the culture war.
Yeah, I mean, I think the beauty of this is that it connects young people to a tradition, right? It engages them in sacred storytelling that has been part of both the queer movement for forever, but also part of the Christian movement. And I think that one of the things that I'm most passionate about is that, we have kids coming out at younger and younger ages, and it's so vital that they get connected to queer and trans elders. that that they are connected to their people, not just so they can understand where they come from, although I think that's really important, but also so they can understand how to survive and so that they can see possibilities of like what it can look like to grow up to be an adult. And I think this is a joy that so many of us who grew up, before the internet, or where we had 3 television channels and none of them had gay people on them, that like we are now in a generation where queer and trans elders are more visible than ever before, and also where young people seem more separated from them than ever before, because I think the avenues of like coming out and into community don't exist in the same way, because kids are coming out in straight cis families often who may or may not have other people to connect them to. And so figuring out how we connect kids and young people to their communities, and then engage them in this work of like, we need your story too. Like it's all of our stories. And this idea of sacred storytelling is a way for us to be in communication across generations. And that's like so powerful and beautiful and profound.
Yeah. And I think for anyone really, but in particular older folks, I'm also thinking about who are coming out and coming into their own. I think queer theology is so important because what we talk about and what we ask for like sets the upper limit of what we can imagine. And so if all we're talking about is it okay to be gay and Christian, that's like the best you could ever possibly be, is like, yeah, sure, I guess it's okay. And like there's a whole lot of in between where it's like not okay, or like maybe it's okay in theory, but like you should be celibate. Whereas like if the upper limit is like random anonymous sex can be sacred, there's a whole lot of space underneath there for like finding holiness, right? I just like on Instagram posted a few days ago like a picture of me in my underwear, and then some slides about like how our bodies aren't diminished by multiple connections with people, and about how inviting a stranger into your bedroom or into a back room is hospitality and is vulnerable, and how casual sex can be holy too. And someone like DM'd us and was like, it took me so long to recognize to accept that I was gay. And I finally like recently accepted that, but I just resigned myself to never having sex. And then I saw your post about promiscuity also possibly being sacred. And that is causing me to like question that and rethink that. And like, actually, maybe I like could be a like fully sexual gay person. And I think that like the common knowledge or our gut instinct is to say like, oh no, like that's going to scare people away. You can't talk about casual sex being sacred. We have to talk about why committed, monogamous, loving marriages are okay, to make space for people. And like we've been having that conversation for 2 decades, and some like me being like a hoe on Instagram and posting about like finding the sacred in casual sex is like the thing that unlocked it for him. And I think that like we need to dream bigger than just like ever so slightly more. Please let us into your club. Please give us some crumbs. Like that's all we could possibly imagine. That like it's so much more expansive than that. And like not to say that like everyone has to go have casual sex, but like I want to like raise the bar on imagining what's possible and creating room for all of us to find space in that, rather than like the compromise being like, I guess I can be gay but be celibate. Like I'm not like willing to accept that.
Yeah, and I think going back to the young folks question, I think raising that bar for them too is really important. Of like, it isn't just that you get to live, it's also that you get to thrive, that you get to have a family if you want it, that you get to have friends, that you get to be connected to a community, that you get to have the body that you've dreamed up, right? Like it's all of these things are possible. And I think that the more that we can have these conversations and let folks know that you don't have to just settle for survival, that there is more that can be for you, and that like wanting that is not only just acceptable, like it's a good and holy thing. And that we have to be telling stories of thriving, so that young folks know that there is there's something for them to grow up into. I think that's really, really vital.
That's great. Well, I feel like we could talk a lot more. I especially have a lot more to learn from Brian. I'm probably the opposite of what you could call a hoe on Instagram in many ways. So lots more to learn. I'm going to have to check out the website, listen to the podcast, see what's going on in there. If people want to continue this conversation, they want to keep hearing from you, reading, so on, where can they do that? Where can they find where you both are?
Yeah, so our website is queertheology.com. We got good luck with that domain. There's a link at the top to resources that has resources organized by topic for allies, for coming out, for sex and relationships, for transgender theology, for like wrestling with is it okay, for looking for how queerness and spirituality enrich one another. So like browse free resources, listen to the podcast, just sort of search Queer Theology on your podcast platform. If you want to go deeper, we also have like a handful of workshops and online courses on those specific topics around like sex and trans issues and being a better ally. And I think like the most special part of all of this is our online community, Sanctuary Collective, which comes with all of those workshops and courses, and then also like a community of like 200-300 people around the world to sort of like ask these questions and go through these workshops together and wrestle with stuff and to like talk about big, deep theological questions, and also to talk about like silly and fun stuff like things people are knitting or first dates, scary, medical diagnoses. So all of that is at queertheology.com. We're on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, all of the social medias if you just search for Queer Theology. And then I'm at This Is BGM on like all of the places.
And I'm at Shannon Kearns on all of the places. I do TikTok badly, but I'm there. But I'm on the rest of them.
You're doing it better than us.
Thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate the perspective. It's really cool. I mean, we talk so much about liberation theology on this podcast, but it's really cool to see, just like you said at the top of the episode, Shannon, that these are circles stacked on top of each other. And I think there's like a lot of interesting overlap that maybe I hadn't considered. So definitely learned a lot.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks both of you for coming to talk with us.
Our pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/themagnificast. We already told you all about it at the top of the episode, so I'm not going to do it again. You can't make me, and I won't do it even if you did. But our intro music is by Amari Armstrong. Our outro music is by The Illogical Spoon, and we'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early. At least I would have